Hey scholars, today we're going to jump into lesson 6.6. This is going to be our last full lesson of new content before the end of the school year, so figured we might as well end it on a happy note. Just kidding, it's called the Black Death for a reason. It's going to get a little gruesome. Alright, for your do now, before we jump into all the gory stuff, you're going to answer 2 questions from the last lesson's exit ticket, just to make sure you understand the concepts before we move on. So number 1 says, what caused the growth of towns? Choose 2. A, guilds, B, trade, C, commerce, and D, councils. Pause the video and choose your best answer. Number 2. What was the impact of the rise of towns? Choose 3. A. Towns lessened feudalism and manorialism as merchants gained power and workers left the manors and headed to towns. B. Towns strengthened feudalism and manorialism as merchants gained power and workers joined manors. C. Increased merchants and merchant suppliers provided an option for poor people to increase their social mobility and climb the economic ladder. D. Guilds provided collective bargaining power where groups of lower classes could petition the king and gain power from the nobles. Pause your video and choose your best 3 answers here. Alright, let's see how you did. So for number 1, your best answers are going to be B and C. And for number 2, your best answers are going to be A, C, and D. If this is not what you got, go ahead and pause your video at this time and adjust your answers. Alright, so moving on to the Black Death. Alright, this is an epidemic, a word that's going to be very familiar to you considering our current climate. An epidemic is an illness that is widespread and devastating, killing many. The Black Death was an epidemic in Europe, just as it was in Asia and Africa when it struck. In England, massive numbers of people caught the illness and died from the illness. But diseases have a greater impact on communities than just who lives and dies. We've seen this before, but we're going to see how illness and widespread illness is really going to impact communities. Again, considering the struggle that we're having in the world with COVID-19 at the moment, this is very relevant to what we're experiencing today, just hopefully not as drastic. So, the Black Death. This is a global epidemic of bubonic plague that struck Europe and Asia in the mid-1300s. The plague arrived in Europe in October 1347 when 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. So you have a ship that's going from just like north of Turkey in the Black Sea. They go around, it's a trade vessel, and they dock at Sicily, which is an island off the coast of Italy. Now, the Black Death is spread through the air by bites from rats and fleas. It's spread through the air by coughs and sneezes of infected people, and the people generally are infected mostly by flea bites. Rats did occasionally bite people, but a lot of it did come from fleas. The plague comes from a bacteria called Yersinia pestis, and this is something that's carried by rats regularly. And there are 3 types of plague that can come from Yersinia pestis. The bubonic plague, which is the most common, septicemic plague, and pneumonic plague. Bubonic plague is a really interesting one because you get these huge infections in your lymph nodes. So your lymph nodes swell and become these boils on your skin. They're super sensitive, super painful, and it's an infection. So it can really get pretty bad. Septicemic plague is when the plague that was bubonic originally infects the blood and it affects the ability for your blood to clot. So what happens with septicemic plague is you just kind of bleed out from everywhere until you die. And pneumonic plague is probably, at least to me, one of the more gruesome ones. Bleeding out's pretty bad. But pneumonic plague, your lungs get so infected that they liquefy and you cough them out and then you die. So none of these are a super nice way to go. And the thing that's kind of crazy about the bubonic plague is Yersinia pestis is a bacteria that is still carried by rats. So the plague does still exist today. However, it's really, really, really easily treated by modern antibiotics that are pretty easy to access. So if people are dying from the plague today, either they're super unlucky or more than likely they're in a really, really poor area without resources from the medical community. Now, you might be saying, Miss Orr, why is it called the Black Death? Has nothing to do with that color. I don't know what's going on. It's called the Black Death because the infection would get so bad that it would start to cause the skin on your extremities, so your fingers, toes, and nose particularly, to become necrotic, which means the skin starts to die prior to the person passing away, and your skin would turn black. So you would see people that had the plague really, really advanced versions of the plague anyway. They would be like having fingers and toes fall off, and it was just super gruesome and horrible. So, in the same way that we're dealing with COVID, these people had to deal with that. COVID-19 is pretty rough, but it still has nothing on the bubonic plague. So, something that's really interesting is the symptoms that come with the bubonic plague. You get these huge swollen lymph nodes that caused blood and pus to seep out of them. You would get all kinds of other symptoms like fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, aches and pains, and then ultimately, death. So super nasty, not a great thing, definitely not something you want to deal with. But this is something that swept through Europe, and it's really going to change all of these social structures that we've been talking about. In our last lesson, when we were discussing the development of towns, that's one of the reasons the Black Plague was able to spread as fast as it was. You have people no longer really living in the country. They're living in towns, cramped, close to one another, coughing and sneezing on one another, and it causes problems. So let's go ahead and jump into our document analysis. All right. Our DBQ is what impact did the Black Death have on Western Europe? Document A is from William Dean. He's an English monk and historian. It's from 1349, so right smack dab in the middle of the 14th century. And like other religious people of the time, he lived within a small community of religious men and helped serve the local community as needed. The text reads as follows. In 1348 and 1349, a plague of a kind which has never been met with before ravaged our land of England. The Bishop of Rochester, who maintained only a small household, lost 4 priests, 5 esquires, or knights, 10 attendants, 7 young clerics, and 6 pages, so that nobody was left to serve him. At Malling Abbey, the bishop appointed 2 abbesses, or religious women, but both died almost immediately, leaving only 4 nuns and 4 novices, or women training to become nuns. One of these, the bishop put in charge of the abbey, for it proved impossible to find anyone suitable to act as an abbess, or head of the nuns. To our great grief, the plague carried off so many people of both sexes that nobody could be found who would bear the corpses to the grave. Men and women carried their own children on their shoulders to the church and threw them into a common pit. From these pits, such an appalling stench was given off that scarcely anyone dared even to walk beside the cemeteries. Again, this is a really gruesome scene, and it's one that luckily we're not having to deal with. But I want you to consider what purpose the monks serve, right? At this point, what you need to know is a lot of the time, the reasons that so many monks and nuns are dying at this point from the plague, like they live out in small, households, more so in the country, but their primary purpose at this point is serving and tending to the people that are sick and dying, right? The monks and the nuns are servants of the church. They're meant to be the hands and feet of Christ, so they're trying to serve the sick and dying people. Makes sense. It's what Jesus did when he was on the earth. That's what they're going to do. They follow his example. So they're dying because they're interacting with these people. And I want you to keep that in mind, that this is why it's significant to get a monk's perspective. This is a person that's on the front lines. He has a very specific calling, he believes, to take care of these people, and it puts him immediately in harm's way. So I want you to keep that in mind. So go ahead and pause your video at this time and complete your questions on your worksheet that deal with document A. All right, document B. This is from Henry Knighton, a priest from St. Mary's Abbey from Leicester in 1349, same year. Knighton wrote an eyewitness account in which he described the effects of the Black Death, especially at the height of the epidemic in Leicester in 1349 and in the countryside as he went about his duties tending to the sick. Document B reads like this. Then the dangerous plague penetrated the sea coast from Southampton and came to Bristol. There almost the whole strength of the town died, struck, as it were, by sudden death. In the same year there was a great plague of sheep everywhere in the realm, so that one place there died in one pasturage more than 5,000 sheep, and so rotted that neither beast nor bird would touch them. And there were small prices for everything on account of the fear of death. There were very few who cared about riches or anything else. A man could have a horse, which before was worth 40 shillings, for 6 shillings. A fat ox for 4 shillings, a cow for 12 ducats, a big pig for 5 ducats. Sheep and cattle went wandering over fields and through crops, and there was no one to go and drive to gather them. There was such a lack of servants that no one knew what he ought to do. So, this is something I think that's a little more relevant to what we're dealing with today. I don't know if you guys have been driving around, but gas prices have been dropping like hotcakes. It's kind of insane. I haven't seen gas prices this low since the 90s. And yes, I know I sound super old. Deal with it. But the prices of goods are dropping because people are like, I don't care. I just don't want to die. Right? And the plague is really affecting the economy. I mean, there are so few servants. They don't know what to do. The servants are the people that really uphold the feudal system, right? We know this. So I want you to keep all that in mind as you answer your questions for document B at this time. So we only have 2 documents today, but we do have some further reading to make sure you really understand the global impact of the plague. So the plague took a terrible toll on the populations of Asia and Europe. China's population was reduced by nearly half between 1200 and 1393, probably because of the plague and famine. Travelers reported that dead bodies covered the ground of Central Asia and India. Some historians estimate that 24 million Europeans died as a result of the plague, about a third of the population. The deaths of so many people speeded changes in Europe's economic and social structure that contributed to the decline of feudalism. Trade and commerce slowed almost to a halt during the plague years. As Europe began to recover, the economy needed to be rebuilt, but it wouldn't be rebuilt in the same way, with feudal lords holding most of the power. After the plague, there was a shift in power from nobles to the common people. One reason was the need for workers was high, but there were fewer workers because so many people had died. The workers who were left could therefore demand more money and more rights. In addition, many serfs abandoned feudal manners and moved to towns and cities seeking better opportunities. This led to a weakening of the manor system and a loss of power for feudal lords. After the plague, a number of peasant rebellions broke out. When nobles tried to return to the way things had been, resentment exploded across Europe. There were peasant revolts in France, Flanders, England, Germany, Spain, and Italy. The most famous of these revolts was the English Peasants' War in 1381. The English rebels succeeded in entering London and presenting their demands to the King Richard II. The leader of the rebellion was killed, however, and after his death the peasants' revolt lost momentum. Still, in most of Europe, the time was coming where serfdom would end. So go ahead at this time and pause your video and complete your answers that deal with the further reading here. So what did we learn? The Black Death is aptly named. It was a deadly disease that spread along trade routes, especially via the Silk Roads and Asian trading ships. They reached port in England and carried the disease, which spread rapidly in Western Europe. The plague devastated nations across the world, killing millions of people across the world in a really short period of time. In England, people and animals quickly succumbed to the disease. The Black Death devastated communities, altering people's usual roles or leaving roles unfulfilled, and it created economic and social disorder, and truly a breakdown of feudal structure. William Dean notes that a plague killed many people in England who lived in close quarters. There's a lowering of population as there is no one to work in the churches or bury the dead. It's likely that other tasks in society also went undone. Additionally, according to Henry Knighton, the plague also killed thousands of animals. The ones that survived, hardly anyone was there to take care of them, so they wandered. Because so many people died, the price for animals also decreased, and clearly the Black Death impacted the economy because there were not as many workers left, and selling goods for money was less profitable as prices for goods began to go down further and further. This disruption in the economy and the workforce caused feudal order to break down, and because feudal order was dependent on peasant labor to work the fields and provide society's goods and resources. As religious leaders, Dean and Knighton are the more educated people in their society and would have likely tended to the sick in their duties. And they would feel compelled to write this history so that future communities struck by the plague would have a previous record of how the plague might affect them. Again, the Black Death, the Black Plague, bubonic plague, whatever you want to call it, really changes the face of Western Europe and even Asia. Really, the medieval world is completely rocked by this thing, and it causes a huge change in pretty much every aspect of life. So I look forward to having a conversation with you all in class, discussing the parallels that we've seen between the Black Death and our current situation with COVID-19. I look forward to chatting with you soon and hope you enjoyed today's lesson.